The rusty chains rattled against the concrete floor as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen was shoved into the holding cell. Her hands were bound behind her back, and dried blood crusted the corner of her lip. The three guards laughed as they pushed her down onto the cold metal bench. "Look at this one," sneered the tallest guard, a man named Briggs with a crooked nose and tobacco-stained teeth. "Navy officer," they said. "Doesn't look so tough to me." Sarah said nothing. She kept her eyes down, her breathing steady. Every muscle in her body was tense, but her face showed nothing. She had been trained for this, trained for much worse than this. The second guard, younger with acne scars across his cheeks, kicked at her boots. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue, sailor girl." This wasn't supposed to happen. Not here. Not in a small county jail in rural Virginia, just 40 miles from the naval base where Sarah had served for 15 years. But corruption had roots that ran deep, even in places that looked safe and quiet. 3 days ago, Sarah had been driving through the town of Millbrook on her way back to base. She'd stopped at a gas station and witnessed something she shouldn't have seen. Behind the building, she'd watched the local sheriff and two deputies loading unmarked boxes into a truck. The boxes had military markings, weapons, ammunition, equipment that should never leave a base. She'd taken photos with her phone. She tried to be careful, but they'd spotted her. Within an hour, she'd been pulled over on a false traffic stop. They'd planted drugs in her car, arrested her, thrown her into this jail where the sheriff's brother-in-law was the head guard. Now she sat in this cell, officially charged with drug possession. Her phone had been taken, her credentials dismissed as fake. No one at the base knew where she was. The corrupt sheriff had made sure of that. "Maybe we should teach her some manners," Briggs said, stepping closer. His breath smelled like whiskey. "Show her what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." The third guard, an older man with gray hair and cold eyes, pulled out his baton. "No cameras in this wing, no witnesses, just us and you, sweetheart." Sarah finally looked up. Her dark eyes met Briggs's gaze with a calm that seemed to unsettle him for just a moment. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. All three guards burst out laughing. "Oh, she speaks," the young one howled. "And she's threatening us. What can you do to us, honey? You're the one in chains." "Yeah," Briggs added, cracking his knuckles. "What exactly are you going to do?" Sarah had spent 12 years in naval special warfare. She'd completed SEAL training when only a handful of women in history had even been allowed to try. She'd served in 6 combat deployments. She'd earned 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and the respect of men who'd initially said she didn't belong. She'd learned to shoot in complete darkness. She'd learned to survive in water so cold it could kill in minutes. She'd learned to break zip ties, pick locks, and disable opponents twice her size in seconds. She'd learned patience, control, when to fight and when to wait. Right now she waited. "Nothing to say now," the older guard taunted. He tapped his baton against his palm. "That's what I thought." The 3 men exchanged looks. Briggs nodded toward the door. "Let's give her some time to think about her situation. Get nice and scared. We'll come back later when the shift changes. Then we'll have all night." They left, their laughter echoing down the corridor. The heavy door clanged shut. A lock clicked. Sarah waited until their footsteps faded completely. Then she stood up slowly, testing her balance. The chains on her wrists were standard police restraints. The cell was old, built decades ago with rusty bars and loose concrete. She looked around carefully, cataloging everything. The bench bolted to the wall, the toilet in the corner, the small drain in the floor, the security camera in the hallway that had been spray-painted over, just as the guards had said. Sarah's jaw tightened. These men thought she was helpless. They thought she was just another victim they could intimidate and hurt. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She closed her eyes and began to count her breaths, centering herself. She'd escaped from worse situations in hostile territory overseas. This was just another mission, and this time She was going to make sure these corrupt men faced justice. The jail cell was quiet except for the distant sound of a television playing in the guard station. Sarah estimated she had maybe 2 hours before Briggs and his friends returned. 2 hours to get out of these chains and find a way to escape. She sat back down on the metal bench and brought her cuffed hands underneath her, sliding them under her legs. It was painful, her shoulders screaming in protest, but she was flexible enough to bring her bound wrists to the front of her body. That was step one. Next, she examined the handcuffs in the dim light. Standard police issue, probably 20 years old based on the rust. The keyhole was visible, but she had no tools. Nothing in her pockets, they'd taken everything. But they'd missed something. Sarah reached up to her hairline where a small bump was barely noticeable beneath her dark hair. A tiny metal hairpin, one she'd kept hidden for years, a habit from her SEAL training. Always have a backup plan. Always have a way out. She pulled it free and straightened it with her teeth. Her hands were steady as she inserted the thin metal into the keyhole of the cuff on her right wrist. This was a skill every SEAL learned. Pick a lock in under 30 seconds or run another 5 miles. She'd gotten very good at picking locks. 15 seconds later, her right hand was free. 10 seconds after that, her left hand joined it. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had bitten into her skin and stood up. Freedom from the cuffs was only the beginning. She was still locked in a cell, in a building full of corrupt guards, with no phone, no weapons, and no backup. Sarah moved to the cell door and examined the lock. This one was older, simpler, the kind of lock that had been installed in the 1970s and never updated. She worked the hairpin into the mechanism, feeling for the tumblers. This took longer, almost 3 minutes, but finally she heard the satisfying click. The door swung open with a soft creak. Sarah stepped into the corridor and paused, listening. Voices came from somewhere to her left. The guard station, probably 50 feet away around a corner. To her right, the corridor was dark and silent. Emergency exit signs glowed red at the far end. She moved right, staying close to the wall, her boots silent on the concrete floor. The years of training had taught her to move like a shadow. Every step was deliberate. Every breath was controlled. She reached a door marked storage and tested the handle. Unlocked. Inside, she found cleaning supplies, old uniforms, and she allowed herself a small smile, a guard's locker that someone had left open. Inside the locker was a jacket, a radio, and a key ring. No weapons, but the keys were valuable. She pocketed them and grabbed the jacket, pulling it on. It was too large, but it would help her blend in if anyone saw her from a distance. The radio crackled suddenly. "Briggs, you there? Sheriff wants an update on the prisoner." Sarah turned the volume down to barely a whisper. She couldn't risk them hearing silence when they expected a response, but she also couldn't let them know she was listening. "Yeah, she's secured," Briggs's voice came through. "Quiet as a mouse. We'll check on her in an hour." An hour. That gave her more time than she'd thought. Sarah left the storage room and continued down the corridor. She needed to find the evidence room. Her phone would have the photos of the sheriff and his deputies loading those stolen weapons. That was her proof. Without it, she was just an escaped prisoner, and they'd hunt her down before she could reach anyone who'd believe her story. She found a stairwell and climbed up one floor. The building was small, probably only 20 cells total. This wasn't a big city jail. It was a county lockup in a town of maybe 3,000 people. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and the sheriff's word was law. The second floor was administrative. She could see office doors with names on them. Sheriff Clayton Hodge, Deputy Martinez, Deputy Sellers, and at the end of the hall a door marked evidence. Sarah tried the keys from the locker she'd found. The fourth key turned the lock. Inside, the evidence room was exactly what she expected. Shelves lined with boxes, each labeled with case numbers and dates. She searched quickly, looking for anything recent. There, a box with yesterday's date. Inside was her phone, her wallet, her military ID, and her car keys. She grabbed the phone and powered it on, praying the battery still had charge. 42%, enough. The photos were still there. Clear images of Sheriff Hodge, his 2 deputies, and 3 other men loading military crates into an unmarked truck. The shipping labels were visible. The base inventory numbers were clear. Sarah forwarded the photos to 3 different people: her commanding officer at the naval base, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and a journalist friend in Washington who specialized in corruption cases. Then she sent a text to her illegally detained at Millbrook County Jail. Sheriff Hodge involved in weapons theft from base. Have evidence. Need immediate extraction. She hit send and watched the messages go through. Done. Even if they caught her now, the truth was out there. But Sarah wasn't planning on getting caught. She pocketed the phone and moved back toward the stairwell. She needed to get out of this building before Briggs and his friends discovered she was gone. And then she needed to make sure these men faced consequences for everything they'd done. Sarah made it down the stairs and back to the first-floor corridor without encountering anyone. The building was quiet, too quiet. Most of the cells appeared empty. This wasn't a busy jail. Maybe that was why Sheriff Hodge had chosen it as his base of operations. Fewer witnesses, fewer complications. She moved toward the back exit, following the emergency signs. Just 50 more feet and she'd be outside. From there, she could disappear into the woods behind the jail. By the time they realized she was gone, help would already be on the way from the naval base. But as she reached for the exit door handle, a voice stopped her cold. Well, going somewhere. Sarah turned slowly. Briggs stood at the end of the hallway, his hand resting on his gun holster. Behind him were the other 2 guards, both armed. All 3 men looked angry now. The mocking smiles were gone. I checked on you early, Briggs said, walking toward her. Wanted to get started on our little talk. Imagine my surprise when I found an empty cell and open door. Sarah assessed the situation quickly. 3 armed men 15 feet away. She was unarmed, exhausted, and trapped between them and the exit. The odds weren't good. But she'd faced worse odds in Kandahar, in Mosul, in places most Americans would never see on a map. You should let me go, Sarah said calmly. I've already sent the evidence to NCIS. They know about the stolen weapons. They know about Sheriff Hodge. It's over. Briggs laughed, but it was a nervous sound now. NCIS. You think anyone's going to believe a druggy prisoner over the sheriff of this county, over us? I'm not a prisoner, Sarah said. I'm a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and you've just committed about 6 federal crimes in the last 3 days. The young guard with the acne scars pulled his gun. His hand was shaking. She's bluffing. She's just trying to scare us. Put the gun down, Sarah said. Her voice was harder now. You're already looking at charges for false imprisonment and evidence tampering. Don't add assault with a deadly weapon. Shut up, the young guard shouted. You don't get to tell us what to do. The older guard with gray hair moved to flank her from the side. Briggs, we need to handle this now. If she really did send something to the Navy. Then we make her disappear, Briggs interrupted. There's 100 places in these woods where no one will ever find a body. We say she escaped, got lost, probably overdosed somewhere. Who's going to question it? Sarah's muscles tensed. This was the moment. Either she walked out of here, or these men would try to make sure she never walked anywhere again. Last chance, she said quietly. Stand down. Let me leave. Face the consequences like men instead of cowards. Briggs's face turned red. Cowards, lady, you're about to learn. Sarah moved. Years of training took over. She spun low, using the oversized guard jacket to mask her movement. The young guard's gun fired, but the shot went wide, hitting the wall behind where she'd been standing. Sarah closed the distance in 3 strides. She grabbed the young guard's wrist and twisted, using his own momentum to flip him forward. He crashed into the concrete floor, his gun skittering away. The older guard swung his baton at her head. Sarah ducked under it and drove her elbow into his solar plexus. The air rushed out of his lungs. She followed with a strike to his knee, not enough to break it, but enough to take him down. That left Briggs. He'd drawn his gun now, but he was backing away, his eyes wide with shock. "What? How did you?" "Navy SEAL," Sarah said, advancing on him. 12 years of combat experience, 6 deployments, hand-to-hand combat instructor. You never asked what I did in the Navy, did you? You just assumed I was nobody important." Briggs raised his gun, but his hand was shaking badly. "Stay back, I'll shoot." "No, you won't," Sarah said. She could see it in his eyes. He was a bully who'd never faced real danger. A man who'd spent his career abusing people who couldn't fight back. "You're not a soldier, you're just a criminal who got caught." She kicked the gun from his hand so fast he barely saw her move. It spun across the floor. Then she grabbed him by his collar and slammed him against the wall. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her face inches from his. "You're going to sit down right here. You're going to put your hands behind your head, and you're going to wait for the federal agents who are already on their way. Understand?" Briggs nodded frantically, all the fight gone from him. Sarah released him and stepped back. All 3 guards were on the ground now, groaning or gasping for air. None of them were seriously hurt, she'd been careful about that, but they were definitely not getting up to cause more trouble. She picked up the young guard's gun and checked the safety before setting it on a high shelf out of reach. Then she retrieved the other weapons and did the same. Just as she finished, she heard sirens in the distance, getting louder, multiple vehicles. Sarah walked to the exit door and pushed it open. Cool night air hit her face. In the parking lot, she could see headlights approaching fast. Military vehicles, 3 of them. The cavalry had arrived. As the vehicles screeched to a halt, the doors flew open. Marines in full tactical gear poured out, weapons ready. Behind them came a man in a Navy officer's uniform, Commander James Peterson, her from the base. "Lieutenant Commander Chen," Peterson shouted, "are you injured?" "No, sir," Sarah called back. 3 suspects inside, disarmed and secured. Sheriff Hodge is still at large." Peterson nodded to his Marines, who rushed past Sarah into the building. Then he approached her, his face a mixture of relief and anger. "Sarah, when we got your message," he shook his head. "NCIS is already executing search warrants at the sheriff's house and the warehouse where they were storing the stolen equipment. We've got him." Sarah felt the tension finally leave her shoulders. "The evidence is solid. Your photos were exactly what we needed. The journalist you contacted is already running the story. By morning, everyone in Virginia is going to know what happened here." Behind them, the Marines were leading the 3 guards out in handcuffs. Briggs was crying now, begging them to understand it wasn't his idea. He was just following orders. Sarah watched them without sympathy. These men had planned to kill her, to make her disappear, all to protect their corrupt little empire. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of debriefings, medical checks, and media attention that Sarah hadn't wanted but couldn't avoid. The story of the Navy SEAL who'd escaped from a corrupt sheriff's jail had gone viral. News trucks lined the streets of Millbrook. Reporters camped outside the naval base gates. Everyone wanted to interview the woman who'd taken down 3 armed guards with her bare hands. Sarah refused all interviews. She'd never sought fame, and she wasn't about to start now. Her job was to serve her country, not to be a celebrity. But the story wouldn't go away. By the second day, the full scope of Sheriff Clayton Hodges' operation had been exposed. NCIS agents had found a warehouse full of stolen military equipment worth over $3 million. Weapons, night vision gear, communications equipment, even explosives. Hodge had been working with a black market arms dealer named Viktor Sokolov, selling equipment to whoever would pay. The two deputies involved had been arrested. So had four other men connected to the operation. The entire criminal network was crumbling. Sheriff Hodge himself had been captured trying to flee to Mexico. Federal marshals had picked him up at the border. Now he sat in a real federal prison, facing charges that would keep him locked up for the rest of his life. Sarah sat in Commander Peterson's office, reviewing the final reports. Peterson leaned back in his chair and studied her with concerned eyes. "You know you're a hero, right?" he said. "What you did took incredible courage. Not just escaping, but getting the evidence out. If you hadn't sent those photos when you did—" "I was just doing my job, sir," Sarah interrupted. "I saw something wrong and I reported it." "And you nearly died for it." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "But I didn't. And now those weapons aren't going to end up in the wrong hands. That's what matters." Peterson smiled slightly. "The Navy brass wants to give you another commendation, possibly a promotion." "I don't need recognition, sir. I need to know this kind of corruption won't happen again." "It won't. Not here. NCIS is implementing new security protocols at every base on the East Coast. They're doing random audits of inventory. Anyone stealing military equipment is going to get caught fast." He paused. "We also need to talk about Millbrook." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The town." "The people are terrified. Their sheriff turned out to be a criminal. Half the county government was involved in the scheme. They don't know who to trust anymore." Peterson pulled out a folder and slid it across the desk. "The mayor called me yesterday. He wants to know if you'd be willing to meet with the town council. Show them that justice still exists, that good people still fight for what's right." Sarah opened the folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, from townspeople in Millbrook thanking her, apologizing for what had happened to her, asking for her help to rebuild trust. One letter was from a woman named Helen Martinez, the mother of one of the deputies who'd been arrested. It read, "My son did terrible things. I can't excuse that, but I want to thank you for not killing him when you had the chance. You could have. Everyone would have understood. But you showed mercy even to men who didn't deserve it. That's real strength. That's real honor." Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. She'd been angry at those men, furious at what they'd tried to do to her, but she'd also known that killing them would have made her no better than they were. "When does the mayor want to meet?" Sarah asked quietly. "Tomorrow afternoon, if you're willing." Sarah nodded. "I'll be there." The next day, Sarah drove back to Millbrook. The town looked different in daylight. Small houses lined quiet streets. A main street with a coffee shop, a hardware store, a library. American flags hung from porches. It looked like 1,000 other small towns across the country, peaceful, ordinary, safe. But she knew now that darkness could hide anywhere, even in places that looked innocent. The town council meeting was held in the local community center. Sarah arrived in her dress uniform, her ribbons and medals displayed on her chest. She debated whether to wear it. She didn't want to seem like she was showing off, but Commander Peterson had insisted. The people needed to see who she really was. The room was packed. Easily 200 people filled every chair and lined the walls. When Sarah walked in, the entire room stood up. The applause started slow, then built until it was almost deafening. Sarah felt her face flush. She wasn't used to this. In the SEAL teams, you did your job and moved on. You didn't get standing ovations. The mayor, an elderly man named Robert Graves, stepped forward and shook her hand. "Lieutenant Commander Chen, on behalf of the entire town of Millbrook, I want to apologize for what happened to you here, and I want to thank you for your courage." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Would you be willing to say a few words to folks?" Sarah hesitated, then agreed. She stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces, young and old, some crying, some smiling, all of them looking at her like she was something special. I'm not good at speeches, Sarah began. I'm a soldier, not a politician, but I want you all to know something. What happened here, the corruption, the crimes, that wasn't your fault. That was the fault of a few bad men who betrayed the trust you gave them. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I know it's hard to trust again after something like this. I know you're all wondering if there are other secrets, other lies, but I've seen the good people in this town. I've read your letters. I've seen how you're standing together to rebuild. That's what real strength looks like. Not muscles or weapons or training. Real strength is continuing to believe in goodness even when you've seen evil. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Thank you for not giving up on us." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I would never give up on people who believe in justice. That's why I serve. That's why I wore this uniform for 15 years, because I believe in protecting people like you. The applause started again. This time, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. After the meeting, dozens of people wanted to shake her hand, to thank her personally, to tell her their stories. Sarah stayed for hours, listening to each person, acknowledging their pain and their hope. As the sun began to set, Sarah finally left the community center and walked to her car. She was exhausted but felt something she hadn't expected to feel. 3 months later, Sarah stood at a podium in the Pentagon, surrounded by Navy brass and members of Congress. The ceremony was formal, the room filled with dignitaries and media cameras. Secretary of the Navy Richard Torres stood beside her, holding a medal in a velvet case. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the secretary announced, for extraordinary courage and devotion to duty in exposing a major criminal conspiracy, for escaping hostile captivity through skill and determination, and for bringing corrupt officials to justice, you are hereby awarded the Navy Cross. The Navy Cross. It was the second highest military decoration in the Navy, surpassed only by the Medal of Honor. Sarah stood at attention as the secretary pinned the medal to her uniform. Cameras flashed. People applauded. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the 3 guards who'd mocked her that night in the jail, about how they'd asked, "What can you do to us?" with such certainty that she was helpless. She was thinking about Sheriff Hodge, who believed his corruption would never be discovered because he controlled a small town far from oversight. She was thinking about how many times in her career she'd been underestimated, how many times men had assumed she couldn't do something because of her gender, how many times she'd had to prove herself over and over. And she was thinking about the fact that she'd never asked to prove anything. She'd simply done her job. She'd seen something wrong and acted to fix it. That was what soldiers did. After the ceremony, Sarah's commanding officer, Commander Peterson, approached her with a smile. "Well, Lieutenant Commander, you've become quite famous. How does it feel?" "Uncomfortable, sir," Sarah admitted. "I'm not looking for attention." "I know, but sometimes attention finds us anyway. The secretary wants to speak with you. There's an opportunity he wants to discuss." Sarah followed Peterson to a private office where Secretary Torres waited along with a 3-star admiral named Patricia Crenshaw. Sarah saluted sharply. "At ease, Lieutenant Commander," Admiral Crenshaw said. "Please sit." Sarah sat, curious and slightly anxious. "I'll get right to the point," Admiral Crenshaw continued. "Your actions in Millbrook exposed serious vulnerabilities in how we secure military equipment and how we handle potential corruption. The Secretary and I believe those vulnerabilities exist across multiple bases." Secretary Torres leaned forward. "We want to create a new task force within NCIS, a team specifically dedicated to investigating internal security threats, theft, corruption, arms trafficking. We want you to lead it." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "Me, sir." "You've proven you have the skills, the integrity, and the courage needed for this kind of work. You don't back down from threats. You don't compromise, and you're thorough." Admiral Crenshaw smiled. "Plus, you're harder to intimidate than most people." "The position comes with a promotion to full commander," Secretary Torres added. You'd be based here in Washington, but you travel to bases across the country as needed. It's important work, Sarah. Work that could save lives and prevent military equipment from ending up in the wrong hands. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing. She'd always been a field operator, someone who preferred action to administration. But this was a chance to make a real difference on a larger scale, to prevent what happened to her from happening to others. I'd be honored, sir, she said finally. Both officers smiled. Good. You start in 30 days. That gives you time to wrap up your current assignment and relocate. Admiral Crenshaw stood and offered her hand. Welcome to the team, Commander Chen. 4 weeks later, Sarah moved into a small apartment in Arlington, just across the river from Washington. It was strange not being on a base, not living among other soldiers, but she was adjusting. On her first day in her new position, Sarah sat at her desk reviewing files on suspicious equipment transfers at 3 different bases. Her team consisted of 4 other investigators, 2 from NCIS, 1 from the Naval Intelligence Service, and 1 from the Marine Corps Criminal Investigation Division. All of them were experienced, sharp, and dedicated. As Sarah studied the files, her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. I wanted to thank you again for what you did. My son is getting help now. He's facing his punishment, but he's also getting counseling. You gave him a second chance by not killing him that night. I'll never forget that. Helen Martinez. Sarah read the message twice, then typed a response. Everyone deserves a chance at redemption. I hope your son finds his way. Take care. She set the phone down and returned to her work. There was so much to do, so many investigations to pursue, so many corrupt officials and criminals who thought they could get away with betraying their country. But Sarah was patient. She was thorough, and she never forgot that justice, like honor, was something you had to fight for every single day. That evening, Sarah drove back to Millbrook. She'd promised Mayor Graves she'd visit the town regularly during the first year after the scandal to help rebuild trust between the community and law enforcement. The town had hired a new sheriff, a woman named Corinne Bosworth who'd spent 20 years as a state trooper. Sarah had personally reviewed her record. She was clean, honest, and tough. At the community center, Sarah met with a group of high school students who wanted to learn about military service. She talked to them about duty, sacrifice, and standing up for what was right even when it was hard. A young girl raised her hand. Commander Chen, were you scared when those guards threatened you? Sarah considered the question carefully. Yes, she said honestly, I was scared. Fear is natural, but I didn't let that fear control me. I stayed calm, I remembered my training, and I did what needed to be done. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear. Another student asked, did you ever want to give up? No, Sarah said, because I knew that if I gave up, those criminals would win. They would keep stealing and hurting people. Sometimes you have to be the one who stands up. You have to be the one who says this is wrong and refuses to back down. After the session ended, Mayor Graves walked Sarah to her car. You know, you've changed this town, he said. People believe in justice again. They believe that good people can win. Sarah smiled. They always could win, Mr. Mayor. They just needed a reminder. As she drove back to Arlington that night, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here. From a small-town girl who'd joined the Navy to see the world, to a SEAL operator who'd faced combat in the world's most dangerous places, to a woman chained in a cell who'd refused to be a victim. She thought about the guards who'd mocked her, who'd asked, "What can you do to us?" with such contempt. If she could send them a message now, it would be simple. I can stand up. I can fight. I can win. Not because I'm stronger or tougher than you, but because I know who I am, and I know what I stand for. That was the lesson she hoped others would learn from her story. That strength wasn't about muscles or weapons. It was about character, integrity, the courage to do what was right even when the cost was high. Sarah Chen had paid that cost. She'd been beaten, imprisoned, threatened, and nearly killed. But she'd survived, she'd fought, she'd won. And now, as Commander Sarah Chen, she was just getting started. The men who'd underestimated her had learned too late that chains couldn't hold someone whose spirit was already free. That mocking words meant nothing to someone who knew her own worth.